We live in a world of injustice. We see it everywhere. But what do you do when that injustice comes against you? I mean, when it gets up close and personal, how do you respond? Sure, there's the system, but what if the system doesn't work? Where do you go? How do you respond to simple, innocent, raw injustice? You're just the victim, and somebody's got it out for you. Hey, I'm Pastor Cary. This is the Growing in the Gospel YouTube channel. And we start a new week, and we're buried in the middle, really coming to the end of Psalm 86. What we do on this channel is we go slow walk through the Psalms every morning and every day. Just for a moment, we look at a verse or two or three, and we're working our way through the Psalms. And we're asking God to teach us about his heart and about his reality. And today we're going to get back to this subject of injustice. I don't know, maybe you've got some bad people after you. Maybe you've got a situation unfolding in your life that you really can't control, but someone has it out for you, or someone has falsely accused you or slandered you, or there's a situation unfolding that just seems like it's out of your control, and you really are innocent. You're not at fault. Well, David, you can identify with David in Psalm 86. David is in trouble. He is doing nothing but trying to serve his God and lead people towards his God, but he's surrounded by enemies. And he has spent this entire psalm lifting up his soul and going to God and doing exactly what we ought to do when it comes to seeking the Lord in times like this. I love so much of this psalm that we've seen already. The verses 8, 9, and 10 about how great God is. He's a God that does wonderful things. Verse 11, teach me thy way, O Lord. Show me what to do here, and I will walk in thy truth. Unite my heart to fear thy name. Verse 11, I'm going to praise you with all of my heart. I'm going to glorify you. I love working down to we left off at about verse 13. For great is thy mercy toward me. Thou hast delivered my soul from the lowest hell. I want to comment very briefly on that phrase. You've delivered my soul from the lowest hell. Every now and then I have someone tell me, especially those of other belief systems, well, though people in the Old Testament, they didn't believe in hell. They really mean Sheol or grave. And that's true. In that sense, they didn't have the fuller picture that we have today from the teaching of Jesus and the New Testament. But a lot of times the insinuation is that there is no afterlife, that they didn't expect an afterlife in the Old Testament. But that's not true, and it's right before us. David had a sense of the lowest hell, or the farthest separation from God. And he straight up says in this verse, God has delivered his soul, his nephesh. Some people don't think that lives on after death, but indeed it does. And David understands that it does in this verse. And he says, God, you've delivered my soul from the lowest hell. This is resurrection, my friend. And David, as an Old Testament follower of God, understood salvation. He understood that it was only available by mercy. And he understood that God was delivering him from something horrible into something wonderful. Well, now we turn today to verse 14 briefly. And I want you to read it. In fact, let's read verse 14 down through the end of the psalm. Because David now is going to recount to God precisely what his trouble is. And I think it's worth noting that it's 13 verses before David even gets to the heart of the problem. And I think that's worth meditating on for a moment, because he asked God to listen to him. He asked God for salvation and preservation. He talks about God being good and ready to forgive and merciful. He talks about God listening to his prayer and giving attendance to his supplications. He mentions his trouble. He says, I'm going to lift up my soul, and when I'm in trouble, I'm going to call upon you. We've talked about all these things, but now he finally gets to the heart of the problem. And I think it's so important for us in terms of a pattern that David's go-to move was to set his mind and heart on his relationship with God before he focused on human injustice and human problems and relational horizontal problems in the world. David is recalibrating his perspective. He's looking up. He's getting his eyes on the Lord. He's reminding himself of who God is. He's reminding God of who God is. He's reminding him of who he is in God's economy and where he sits in the grand scheme of things in terms of salvation and mercy and grace. So by the time he gets to verse 14, The injustice of planet Earth, that it's first exceedingly temporal, and it's radically downsized by contrast to the magnitude and the magnificence of the grace and the mercy and the goodness of God that's just wrapped him up. By the time he gets to verse 14 and he begins to talk about the injustice and his enemies and the vulnerabilities of his life, I just have a sense that that he's in a very different place, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, that he is completely bubble wrapped, if you will, in eternal, in the spiritual bubble wrap of God's grace and mercy. And that he's just, at this point, he's durable, he's impenetrable, he's living in covenant love with his heavenly Father. And it's almost an afterthought. You know, it's all the way down to verse 15, and it doesn't last very long before he's right back to God's goodness. So here's his one appeal about the injustice that's unfolding around him horizontally in human life. He says, "O God, the proud are risen against me." Proud men, arrogant people, and the assemblies of violent men have sought after my soul. Now, this is interesting. So he knows that violent people are coming after him. He knows that councils of violence and councils of enemies are risen up against him in pride, and they're planning a diabolical takeover. But David has already rehearsed his covenant relationship with God. He's already expressed, "God, I know you've delivered my soul from the lowest hell." He's already said earlier in the psalm, "I'm lifting up my soul to you." There's a very deep and pervasive sense that David is putting his soul in the hands of God and knows that ultimately and eternally his soul is secure in the mercy and the grace of God. So how much has that calibrated now his sense of how vulnerable his soul really would be? Okay, I don't get the sense that he's very worried at this point, as much as he's reminding God that, hey, my soul is in your hands. I've lifted up my soul to you. You've promised to preserve my soul. You have saved my soul from the low. You've delivered my soul from the lowest hell. All this soul talk. And now he says, "Oh, but God, just don't forget, some pretty bad men, some bloody men, some violent men are seeking after my soul, and they've not set thee before them." These are men that don't want you. They've disregarded you. They don't know you. David is appealing to God humbly, dependently, and he's contrasting. "God, I'm yours. These men are not. They want nothing to do with you, and they're trying, frankly, to disrupt your plan and your covenant in my life. They're trying to break down your promise. They're trying to discredit you. God, these are not just my enemies, they're your enemies. They've sought after my soul and have not set thee before them." Look at verse 15, and we'll stop for today. But, so the conversation turns now. "But thou," his eyes go right, for half a second, his eyes are on his enemies. But then he's drawn right back. It's like the Lord reaches down and grabs his chin that's now looking at his enemies, and, "Oh no, Lord, these enemies," and like God just lifts his head again. You ever do that with a little child? God just lifts his chin, "Look up, remember who I am." And he says, "But thou, O Lord, art a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering, and plenteous in mercy and truth." Oh, I wish I could break that down, every single word, for another 20 minutes on every word. He is full of compassion. That is loving pity. It's another word for merciful, okay? He is a God that's overflowing with compassion, and he's gracious. I think of the word grace as giving me what I could never deserve. And God's grace is unending. He is the God of all grace. And when you come into a relationship with him by Jesus, you become the child of his grace. You relate to him on the basis of grace. You swim in an ocean of grace. You have all the grace you could ever have and want and need, and you have plenty to give away. You'll never exhaust it. He's gracious. He's long-suffering. I get the sense here, and I've been thinking about this word as I was preparing to record. I think David is saying, "Lord, I know I don't deserve justice. I know that in my own sinfulness, I deserve whatever comes upon me. But Lord, In other words, I'm not appealing to you on the basis of my goodness, God. Like, I deserve your salvation. I deserve your intervention. I deserve your defense. He's not saying that. He's saying in spite of me. It's not about me. You, Lord, it's all about you. It's all about who you are. You are a God full of compassion. You are gracious. You are long-suffering. You know every worst, terrible thing about me, but you still love me. You're long-suffering, and you're plenteous in mercy. You're ready to forgive me. You're ready to justify me. You're ready to pour out your forgiving, loving, gracious exoneration and pity and compassion upon me. And truth. You're a God of truth, and what you say is true, and what you promise is true. David, I just love this because David is appealing to God on the basis of God's goodness, not his own. How many times do you think, well, I don't deserve this? Thinking about the idea of injustice. I don't deserve this. What did I do wrong? And David's not appealing that way. It's almost the sense of, I know I deserve something. I know I'm sinful and imperfect. I know that I could never deserve the love and the mercy and the salvation, the intervention of God. But God, you are merciful. You are compassionate. You are gracious. You are truthful and long-suffering towards me. So God, it's not on the basis of my goodness. It's on the basis of yours. So I want to wrap up with two quick admonitions. And the first has to do with what I started with. How do we respond to injustice? Well, the first answer to that is you put your oppressors in the hand of God. Just right out of the gate, refuse to take matters into your own hands. Now, I'm not saying don't appeal to the systems or to HR or whatever you need to do to work within the boundaries of the ethical systems around us. But when the systems fail you, my friend, and when the systems are insufficient, you don't take matters into your own hands. You put them into God's hands. And you explain your heart and your cause, and you get your eyes back onto God, and you lift up your soul to God. And you remind your own soul, and you remind God of who he really is. And then you appeal to him. This is the second thing. You appeal to him on the basis of his goodness and his mercy and his grace. So you're asking for his defense. You're asking for his intervention, not because you deserve it, but because that's who he is. And you know you are in a covenant relationship with him. And so you're trusting him to handle the problem. You're trusting him to right the wrong, to settle the injustice. Oh, my friend, I could tell you so many stories of in my own life and in friends of mine's lives who refuse to take matters into their own hands when a work situation or a church situation or some other situation was really handled poorly and injustice was really an experience, a very real experience. And you let God write the story. And you let your work speak for itself. You let your life speak for itself. You say, Cary, you don't know who's slandering me, and you don't know the false narratives, and you don't know the lies. I may. I'll just tell you a quick story, and then I'll let you go for today. Some months ago, actually back in the winter, I don't know how to say this story in vague terms. I want to be as vague as possible. I was speaking at a pastor's meeting. And I don't know why, but a couple of cantankerous individuals and frankly deceptive individuals misunderstood the nature of the meeting, which was just designed to help pastors and churches grow and advance and develop and to mentor younger pastors and to encourage them and really to grow in expositional skills and in pastoral heart and compassion for God's people. It was just a really good opportunity for pastors to grow in friendship and love and encouragement to each other. Well, for whatever reason, a couple of guys took that meeting, mischaracterized it, created a graphic that made it appear to be something that it wasn't, having to do with an issue in Christendom that is an issue of contention. And the sad thing is that the narrative was completely artificial. It was completely fake. This man and another man, they had put together this graphic and married it to each other, and then they had put it out on social media, and then it began to grow like wildfire. And me and my two friends that were speaking at this meeting began to get phone calls and texts about, the nature of this meeting. And it was a bunch of nothing. It was just a bunch of wildfire over nothing. For me, it didn't affect me really at all, but I felt terrible for my two friends because it really did create a problem in terms of slanderous information. The reason I say it wasn't a problem for me is I think I talked to two people who heard my explanation and they just went, "Oh, okay." But what was sad is it was unjust, it was untruthful, it was very deceptive, and it was very hurtful to a couple of really dear friends and very good men who are mentors and encouragers in my life, who have very pure hearts when it comes to loving people and teaching the Word of God. And it was hard to see those two friends respond to false accusations and mischaracterizations and overt deception, just lies. And once the record was set straight with the people that reached out and asked, everybody was fine, except for the fact that there's still a lot of people that believe that narrative, that never did ask, that never did look. They just read the social media stream and rolled with it. And it's unfortunate, but God knows those stories, and God knows how to correct the narrative. And over time, He does. Over time, the accusers can be exposed, and they can enter into their own season of regrets. And over time, God can just write the record because of the lives and the integrity and the faithfulness and the story of the people that were falsely accused. Now, I don't know what your situation is. I don't know what injustice you're facing. But the point here is that God does, and you can talk to Him about it. And He's a God who doesn't just require or expect you to walk through injustice. He walked through it Himself for you. And so when you feel like you're alone in the jaws or in the grip of injustice, run to God like David did. Lift up your soul. Pour out your case. But most importantly, put it into His hands. And then appeal to Him on the basis of His mercy and His grace and His goodness. And remember this, you have the King of heaven standing on your side. He has also walked through the valley of injustice, and He will write the record in His time. Until then, be faithful. Don't take matters into your hands. Don't take action you're going to regret. Don't overreact. Act biblically, act prayerfully, act faithfully, act wisely, and let Him write the story. That is Growing in the Gospel for today. I hope you'll share this with somebody. I hope you've been encouraged. Drop a comment, share a thought, ask a question. I love interacting with you, and have a great day. I'm praying for you. I'll see you tomorrow.